Hello and welcome to another episode of the magical world of G. Michael Vasey. And in this episode I'm talking to a medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. She lives currently in the big state of Texas in the USA, and she is a medical intuitive and a clairvoyant. She's written books on all kinds of topics from aliens to relationships. Please welcome Dr. Rita Louise.
I was looking at your website earlier this evening, and you do almost everything I can think of in a sort of paranormal or magical sense.
Pretty much.
How would you describe yourself in terms of all those interests? What's the common theme?
Weird. I just follow whatever seems interesting to me in that moment. You know, my first two books were about health and healing and psychic-y, energy medicine type stuff. And I'm like, okay, wrote about that. Let's move on to the next topic. It's like, how much can you write about one topic?
Yeah, I understand, but you've aliens, and I was like flabbergasted looking at the list of stuff that you've done. What got you started?
So I decided that I wanted to become psychic when I was 12, but by that point in time, I had worked my way through the entire archaeology and anthropology department at my local library. You know, so really doing psychic stuff or, you know, energy medicine, you know, that whole area, you know, self-growth was my second love in life. And reading about and exploring really old stuff was my first. You know, and so my connection to the alien stuff is really about ancient alien material and not contemporary ufology, which is too new.
Yeah, I saw that. It's more Nephilim type and that kind of interest. Yes, yeah. Mm-hmm. But did you? Were you psychic as a kid? Did you see things? I mean, was there something that triggered all of this? Because I often ask a lot of magicians, the magic people that I have on, they all, like me, they got interested very, very young and not for very obvious reasons, usually just because they were inclined, I guess. Weird.
So, I mean, I'm looking at your picture, so I'm not dating myself too much here. So growing up, there was two TV shows. One was The Amazing Kreskin, who was a mentalist and had ESP, and he did a show where he would find things in the audience and, you know, these hypnotherapy things where he would get like people to cluck like chickens and stuff like that, which I thought was fascinating. Yeah. And then there was a TV series called The Sixth Sense, which was about a college professor who taught paranormal studies. Anyway, and he had ESP. You know, so he would walk into a room and pick up a piece of paper, and the dead person would come and give him a clue as to who killed them. So kind of between those two shows, that's really what got me interested in the whole ESP thing. And I didn't think I had any psychic abilities, or maybe I had a little bit or whatever. And then when I was 30, I found the Berkeley Psychic Institute and started studying with them, and came to the realization that I had been very psychic my whole life. And when you know, pick up a gift and know what's inside, you know, on some level, like that is a psychic thing that you're not supposed to know. It's like, oh, that's what that was. You know, I would just write it off to like a weird coincidence or some kind of synchronicity, or, you know, I would just write it off. And not really just didn't recognize that, you know, the experience I was having was a psychic experience.
So what kinds of experience did you have that you now would think of as a psychic experience?
So probably the most, I'll say, profound. I mean, there were, you know, I would just sit there and talk to people and just say like, blah, blah, and then they'd come back and say, oh, well, that happened. But for me personally, I was about 20, and I was doing drafting for Memorex. They made 8-inch floppy drives or floppy disks. And there was a lab next door to me that did some kind of testing thing. And I was friends with the lab assistant, and I would go in and say hi to the manager. And, you know, he was old. And he didn't come into work one day. And so, you know, I would do my regular go in, say hi. And this story always sounds so terrible. He had like a really good comb over thing going on. And so he had this little round Band-Aid on the top of his head. And so my cognitive brain said, oh, he must have a zit up there. And it was, you know, like oozy and pussy. So he put the little Band-Aid there to cover it up. And I walked over to him. I mean, I will never forget this. I walked over to him. I crossed my arms. I looked him square in the face. And I said, well, where were you yesterday? Having them check for a brain tumor? Well, that's where he had been the day before. Oopsie.
Right. Got it. Okay. Still looking at your website. You really have done everything. But the one thing that stuck out at me when I was looking at all of this was the attached entities concept. Because this is something that has interested me quite a bit. I've developed some ideas about what attracts bad things, and that some of the bad things that I attracted and other people have attracted often have an existence of their own, and I feel like they feed off of certain emotions. Exactly. And I also think that we can create our own entities, thought forms, parasites by the way we behave, think, and do. And we continually give these things energy, and eventually they start sucking energy off us like a vampire and can almost take off with a life of their own. So that this idea of attached entities was something that really interested me.
Well, and it sounds like we're kind of on the same wavelength about it.
What sort of conclusions did you come to with regard to these things?
So, I mean, and I will self-disclose, so I had my own attached entity. His name was George. And when George would come and invade my space, it was like PMS on overdrive. You know, I would go into this very dark and ugly place and stay there for a week, maybe 2 weeks. And then something would happen. Someone would tell some kind of a weird joke. It was like the clouds parted and the sun could finally shine through, and I could come back and become my regular self again. At Berkeley, it was really brought to my attention, like, you know, there's this guy standing there, which I really wasn't aware of, and spent time trying to separate who I was from me on George, having him affect my energy. Finally went to a friend who did hypnotherapy, and we were going to work on something else, and that took like 5 minutes to work on. And so we ended up starting to talk about George, and it turned out that I had been in a past life with George. The imagery was something to the effect of, I was a woman, I was really scared, I had left the house to go do something, and I wasn't supposed to, and it was this big secret. And the impression I got, and which the therapist also got, was that I was pregnant, and I was going to find out if I was truly pregnant. Well, then George finds out, and he killed me. And I don't know, you know, sometimes you just have to end the game and say, you know, I don't want to participate in this anymore. I have not experienced George again. A number of years ago also, I mean, I started doing ghost hunting as being the psychic for a ghost hunting group. And it was interesting because around that point in time, I started getting a lot of clients who had entity issues. And this was before the concept of attached entities was, you know, now everybody has an unattached entity. It used to be, you know, well, I had past lives where I had these issues and they're affecting me now. And people have kind of let that go. You know, now they have entity attachments, and it's to blame for every woe in their lives. But this was before that period. And for some reason, without writing anything, because there was no material about that on my website. I hadn't written a book about it. People were finding me, and they didn't come saying I have an entity issue. They would come because there was something going on with them, and then I would kind of look at their energy and notice that there was a presence around them. So, for example, this is one of my favorite entity stories. So usually I work with people that have really hardcore medical issues. I mean, I work as a medical intuitive, and so people that have digestive disturbances or are constipated or are going to a doctor and kind of want a second opinion. So it's more really medical related. Well, her complaint was bulimia, which, you know, in my mind is more of a psychological issue versus a physical functional issue. And she made this comment because first I asked her how much she ate, and she said 5 Big Macs, which I was flabbergasted. And I was like, well, is that with the Coke and fries? And she says, oh yeah. And I'm like, so is that like in the day or through the course of a week? What are we talking about here? She goes, oh no, in one day. I mean, that would be like dinner. And then she would go and vomit it back up. And she made this comment that made me kind of shift my focus, because when you're working intuitively, it's really about where your intention is focused. And she said, well, you know, I've had people tell me that I was possessed. And I just thought it was a very odd comment. And I said, well, let me take a look to see if you have an entity around you. And she had a young man, I would say he was about 17 or 18 years old, who was very hungry all the time. And we did work on having him resolve taking his next step and open the vortex to, going to the light. And there was this extremely palpable shift in the energy as he stepped through to the other side. I mean, palpable enough that she noticed it. 2 weeks later, she called me up and she says, it's gone. I haven't had that behavior since our session.
It's really interesting because it's kind of tempting to think that this is just like a psychological, like a placebo effect, a psychological placebo effect, that someone has a problem like that particular problem or an anger management problem or something, and then you come along and you say, well, you've got an attached entity that's causing that, and we can work through getting rid of that attached entity. And it's almost like a placebo effect. They believe it's going to work, and so it works, and psychologically they change. So on one level, I could see that as being like a psychological mechanism. And on the other level, I know, because I've experienced and seen it myself, that these things are real. Mm-hmm. But you see, I've also trained in magical techniques, and one of the things that I hold very true is that I'm responsible for myself, and any issue in life that I have, there's only one person that's responsible, and that person is quite clearly me. I don't blame my issues on other people. That's a waste of time, and I certainly wouldn't say I've got some kind of an entity. But what I'm trying to say is it's like all magical techniques. There seems to be, it's a double-edged sword. You can look at it purely from a psychological perspective, and if it works, it works. And on the other hand, you can look at it from a spiritual perspective and see something deeper and darker perhaps at work and at play. Do you find that with the people that you deal with, that it could be seen either as a psychological problem and or a spiritual problem, or is it quite clear to you which way the wind is blowing?
It's usually pretty clear which way the wind is blowing. When I have people that message me, that want to set up an appointment because they have an attached entity, and they write that in their email. I have an entity attachment. It started 6 months ago. My knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, okay, well, we can talk about it, but I'm not necessarily going to buy, that you have an entity, because entities are the narcissists of the spirit world, and their goal is to control and manipulate somebody else's energy. and their
Yeah.
behaviors, and keep them in a very funky, negative, emotional place. Well, if they reveal themselves to you, now you can go and do something about it. So it is not in their best interest to make themselves be known. So if I have stuff going on and I'm running around going, oh, I have an attached entity, you probably don't. That's my thought.
I think the one example that you used seemed to me to be a disincarnate human. Mm-hmm. But I've come across other types. In particular, I think in particular the two types that I described. One is where the person has themselves created it as a thought form. Mm-hmm. And a good example would be the guy that's lusting all the time and thinking and behaving in a certain way and creates some kind of a thought form attachment and gives it so much energy that at some point it kind of becomes almost self-aware and it needs to survive. So in a sense, it tries to make the person who created it continue to have those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors in order to feed its need for energy. And then the other kind is just non-human, the kind of entity that I think exists in our reality and probably is the reason for the vampire myth. It actually feeds off of our energy. Have you come across either of those kind of entities?
So my belief is that any entity, whether it's a discarnate human or some kind of alien entity, that's what I like calling them, is alien entities, right. They all feed off of our energy, period. Yep. Whether we're doing it intentionally or not, because there's always some kind of emotional tie, or behavioral tie. They will entice you to go have another drink. They will take a situation and then make you ruminate about it and kind of put you into this emotional tizzy, because while you're in the emotional tizzy, in this rumination place, you're not present, you're not in your body, and they can control and manipulate everything that's going on. And yes, I have seen non-human alien entities, some very weird ones, some not so weird. And the thought forms, I've seen that as well. And it's interesting when I have worked with people and their issue that they think is an entity is actually a thought form, and I don't know how this will translate, trying to explain this, and so let me know if this makes sense or not. So when I'm working with an entity, I actually will do energy work on the entity, on the person, on the entity, because if they're not transitioning, there's some reason they're not, and helping them get past that emotional part will help to set them free. But when you do energy work on a thought form, it disintegrates and it just goes away because it's just energy. There's not anything, even from a ghost point of view, there's not anything substantial there. So if you give it a grounding cord and try to get it to calm down, relax, whatever, it literally will disappear. Which is how I can tell if I'm dealing with an entity or a thought form.
Right.
But yeah, thought forms are created because somebody just keeps thinking about stuff. I have a client who I've done a lot of work with her, a lot of work with her mom. So her mom is getting dementia and the veil is thinning for her. And so her mom will make some comment about, well, who's that in the backyard? Which there is somebody in the backyard, which, it's fine. All right, I think it's fine. But it freaks her out. And I'm like, you need to stop worrying about it. I mean, I don't have an issue that you call me up. And if it's something bad or evil, we're going to address it. But if it's your mom's brother who's already passed, I'm not going to kick him out. Because he's there trying to watch over her. So stop freaking out, because I don't want you to create a thought form that now is living in your house.
Yeah. I try to do energy exercises from Israel Regardie. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he used to be with the Golden Dawn. and was the Beast secretary, personal secretary, Aleister Crowley. And he wrote several good books, one of which was a very short book. It had this meditation in where you circulate light energy around yourself in certain ways. And I always imagine when I'm doing that any kind of thought form that's developing or any kind of attachment is basically obliterated by the energy that I'm circulating around myself. And that seems to me to be fairly effective. And if that doesn't work, then I just do a lesser pentagram ritual, and that certainly does the trick.
And let me just respond. One of the things, thought forms are kind of a different category. So doing energy work and keeping your energy clear is great. If it's an attached entity, many times the individual has some kind of a boundary issue. They very often have dissociation issues. Not that they have multiple personality or dissociative dysphoria or whatever that's called issues, but they tend to dissociate, and and once they're able to reclaim their boundaries and ground themselves and be whole and solid and present within their space, it will move the entity out. So when I'm working with someone, it's like, well, we need to resolve what's going on inside of you so that you're not allowing yourself to get into that space, because the entity will come back if it's being belligerent and doesn't want to take its next step. Then the real recourse is for you to work on you so that you can be whole.
Very much so. I was just also looking here, what's the Institute of Applied Energetics?
So the Institute of Applied Energetics is a school that I created to train people in doing energy work, energy medicine, intuitive counseling, and medical intuition evaluations.
So what is medical intuition?
So medical intuition is, and I'm just going to make this really simple. Medical intuition is basically doing a psychic reading, but the focus of the reading is talking about a person's health.
Yeah.
So there are people that will self-identify as being a medical intuitive, but really they're just looking at the health of your aura and your chakras and just working with your subtle body. To me, a true medical intuitive, and I might be a bit biased here, will actually look at the health of the organs and glands and tissues of the body, so that if someone comes and they say, well, I'm having this discomfort in my back, you can look at their kidneys, for example, and identify, is it inflamed? Is there bacteria in there? Are there stones in there? And do a much deeper level of assessment to answer their questions. And there's a caveat, medical intuition is a diagnostic tool. It's not necessarily, when you work or study to be a medical intuitive, in most cases, it does not include classes in herbology or natural medicine or anything. It really is like getting a psychic reading, so anything that comes above that, there might be guidance that you get intuitively to help someone, but that's, to me, that doesn't fall under the medical intuition umbrella, which is why I went back to school and got a degree as a naturopath. So, because people would come and it's like, okay, well, I got this stuff going on, so what can I do about it? So I think people really are looking for answers and not just, what's going on per se.
What is for you then like psychic reading? How do you do that? Try to describe it if you could.
Sure. So when I go to like a fair, I do a lot of trade shows, or I used to do a lot of trade shows, health and wellness expos, and I'll like throw out cards and do a reading using cards. But when I'm working with my clients, the way I like to explain it is, you're paying me a lot of money and you know where your owies are, whether it's a physical owie, there's something going on at work, there's something going on in your relationship, you know what it is. And so if you want to maximize my time and your time with me, then just tell me what's going on, and then I can kind of dig into more details. And so for me, the question is the key, so once I have like, this is the issue, that I'm going after, then I start internalizing questions, looking at different aspects of what's going on, or I might be guided to ask a different question to really look at the situation in its entirety and present that information to the person. I am very visual, so I'm very clairvoyant. I am very kinesthetic, so I get feelings about things. I'm not particularly auditory, although I do receive a certain amount of information on an auditory level. So it's kind of multimedia, and it's just interesting. And, people go, well, how do you know? And it's really about just working with it. My belief is that we're all psychic, and some people are much more open to receiving information versus someone else. It's kind of like dancing. Some people can dance great. Other people will have a hard time just even keeping with the beat. I tell my students when they're approaching me, it's like, well, can you teach me to be psychic? It's like, no, I can create situations where you can have experiences and you can validate the experience, because when you validate the experience, that's how you learn that you're psychic or that you have tapped into that information. Kind of like the story about the brain tumor. I blew it off. And it wasn't until, another 10, 15 years later that I realized that it was a psychic experience.
Yeah, I understand, because I am psychic, but I wouldn't necessarily want to put myself in a situation where I was trying to give somebody some advice. But I do see things. And I think a good example that I've used before is a couple of friends, magical friends, and myself went to a stone circle on the border with Scotland, and we did a little bit of a ritual there, and a ritual involving the elements. And we felt very much that we'd woken the stone circle up. We could feel the energy increase in magnitude. And as we were standing there, just sort of taking in the view and the feelings, I saw this woman step out from behind the big stone at the end, and she started coming towards me. And I was thinking, well, she's dressed weirdly. And as she came towards me, I said to my two friends, oh, look, we've got a visitor. And as I said that, she just faded away into nothing. My two friends were stood there looking down the path, looking for physical people. And I started laughing. I said, no. She stepped out from behind the stone, and I think she was saying thank you. I think she was, the spirit of the stones. And on the way back, as we walked down the pathway that they'd looked down, we passed a little copse of trees and things. And this was quite late in the year. And it was absolutely alive with butterflies and bees. And we just stood there for 2 or 3 minutes looking at all these insects flying in this copse. So that's the kind of psychism, I experience. It's visual, and I don't hear anything. Well, I do hear things, voices, but it's mainly visual. But I couldn't imagine putting myself in front of somebody and giving them advice. And yet, when I was a boy, teen, growing up in Yorkshire, England, my mother knew this lady. I can't remember her name, and we used to go and see her. And she was an older lady, so this would be early 1970s. And we'd just sit and have a cup of tea, and she'd just start talking and telling me the most amazing things about my past, what I was thinking, what was going to happen to me. And I've never met anybody quite so good as this lady. I wish I could remember her name, but she was absolutely amazing. And it was just sitting, having a cup of tea with this lady, and then on the way out, you'd slip her 20 quid, So I know that it can be done, and it can be done very well. So in terms of gaining psychic impressions on people, is it something you can do just over the telephone, or because I've done like tarot card readings over the phone, and I'm never entirely convinced, or remotely. There's a guy in the US that does mine, And I'm never really convinced that doing it long distance like that is really that good. What's your opinion on that? Because you do this, I know you do the long distance readings.
So at this point in time, all of my clients are long distance. I
really?
lived in Seattle and had a practice. Then I moved to Dallas and had a practice. But, when I moved to Dallas, I knew that I needed to expand and be able to work with people remotely because it was Dallas. And now where I live here, I live in Podunk, East Texas. So there isn't anybody coming to my house or my office for a reading. My feeling is, so when I'm doing a session with someone, when I'm accessing information to share with them, many times I'll close my eyes. And if I'm doing a health-related thing, it's kind of funny, and it's probably just as well that I'm not facing them, because I will actually reach out and grasp in my mind's eye an organ or a gland and kind of squeeze it and feel into it and, manipulate it. Palpate it. That's my very doctor term. I palpate it and receive whatever the impression is from that. And so it's not like I'm really looking at them. It's not like I'm actually touching them. And so whether they're in a chair across from me or they're 500 miles away, it doesn't really matter.
Interesting. When I engage in this, asking this guy in the US to do my cards, I should be, it doesn't really matter.
It doesn't really matter.
And you read tarot cards as well?
Only at trade shows.
Okay. It's not something, and do you work with tarot cards in any other way? Because I use them as meditation
I don't even use tarot cards. I use what are called dream cards, and I do more of an aura reading using them. Yeah. So doing that kind of a reading is there's step A, step B, step C, and I'm more of a free flow kind of gal and want whatever information is going to want to come in. When you work at a trade show, people just sit down and they have this expectation that you talk without really any communication. And so I find doing tarot readings or card readings easier to do a cold reading. When I'm working with my clients, they come with issues. And my least favorite kind of person to do, even though I'll do it at trade shows, is someone that doesn't have an issue that they're looking to resolve.
So I get the impression of you as a person, and I look at the website, and I'm still intrigued at the range of topics that you've written books on, for example. So what are you working on right now? What's the current interest?
So my most recent book was The Dysfunctional Dance of the Empath and Narcissist, and which looks at relationship dynamics, especially dysfunctional relationship dynamics. And so I released that just about a year ago. And I have been doing additional work because I'm feeling like I'm going to do a revised and expanded version of that book because I think the material that I'm working on right now fits well into the book, but I don't know, because I'm kind of in process, if it would be material that I could put together as a standalone book. So like today, articles that I was working on or things that I was working on is why do people stay in a relationship? How do you know, separate one, how do you know if you should stay or not? And then another one, are you staying because you're happy or you're comfortable? Yeah. So it's really looking at that whole relationship topic, but kind of breaking it down into smaller pieces. So that's what I'm working on these.
Okay, so if people want to learn more about you and your books, where can they go?
Sure. So they can go to my primary website, which is soulhealer.com, SOULHEALER.com, soulhealer.com. And that has information about my books, which are all available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all that good stuff. There's a ton of articles, there's videos, there's just a ton of stuff. If someone's interested in the training, there's a link that will take you to the training webpage, where you can get more information about that. But it's kind of like the Mecca of Dr. Rita.
Thanks to Dr. Rita Louise for being my guest today. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed it and would like to follow or like, I would very much appreciate that. Please do share the podcast around. Do follow at whatever source you listened to it from. In the meanwhile, if you are interested in learning more about Dr. Rita Louise, please see the notes below this podcast and you will there find her website and where you can find her books and find more information about her. Once again, many thanks for joining. See you again next time. Bye.